My name is Beverly Beal. I am the interim director of operations for the museum, which means I am temporary. It's a pleasure to have all of you here. Each one of you is important to us. I will point out that the mayor is here. Thank you, Mayor. And beside you is our new city manager. Would you introduce him, please?
Yeah, this is Scott Hildebrand. Scott is our new city manager of the city of Lenore. Came to us from Morganton, and before that he was manager of Beaumont. So
Glad to have you here. Thank you for being here with us today. We also want to welcome the sister of Senator James Broyhill. Allie Stevens is here, and we're always glad to see you. And this presentation today is the outgrowth of some unhappy circumstances, but fortuitous in the long run for us. And I think Senator Broyhill would join me in that sentiment. Senator Broyhill was scheduled to make this presentation on the Battle of Kings Mountain for us, but became ill. And he's recovered from that illness, and my last report was he's doing quite nicely, and we were happy about that. But he called upon his friend. Now, Randall Jones, I'm going to give him the honorary title, at least a professor. For I am sure he has taught somewhere, somehow, sometime, because of his vast knowledge of the subject and his depth of his studies. Before I do that, at his request and with his participation, we have a card here for Senator Broyhill, a Get Well card. And we think it's a good idea for each and every one of you to sign it, so it will go to you. And so we'll start off with his sister. And we'll just pass it around. All right. Now, when you get through passing it around, my wife Judy is right back here in the back, in the black jacket. Don't raise your hand here. Somebody get it for her, please. Hand that right there. Now, a little bit of housekeeping. We have a nice sized crowd. We're happy about that. Let's talk about exits. In case of an emergency, the exit sign, which is not illuminated at the moment, is the door you came in. That's an exit. Myra Dixon, stand up, please. Myra Dixon is stationed there. If there is an emergency, she will be yelling and screaming to follow her. There is another exit at the far end of the room. Follow Myra Dixon out those doors. There is also another emergency exit, and it's this way and down the hall to the right. Gary Bradshaw right back there to be sure that you know that in case of an emergency. All right? Now, Mr. Jones adopted his home. He adopted North Carolina as his home after earning his master's in business administration at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. A Wake Forest fan has difficulty with that phrase, but it's okay. Now, he is a native of Arkansas. Grew up in Memphis.
Beverly.
Sir. We have that.
We have no signal.
Professor Jones has written about the subject of the Battle of Kings Mountain, and he's also been a past president of the Over Mountain Victory Trail Association. Our local Bill Stronach has also been involved in that. I have made several attempts to get hold of his son Bill and have not been able to reach him, hoping he would be here today. There's an article about him in the paper today. He is, Professor Jones lives in Winston-Salem. He is an author, an historian, and I am sure a wonderful storyteller. Professor Jones, you're welcome. Please go ahead.
It was the summer of 1780. 5 years after the shot heard round the world was fired on the village greens of Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. And in those 5 years, the Continental Army under the command of General George Washington was fighting against the red-coated soldiers of the British Army, with each side winning some battles and losing others, so that after 5 long years, the American Revolution had come pretty much to a stalemate. And that's when the British decided to try for the second time their southern strategy. You see, they believed on reliable reports that the interior counties, the back country of the southern colonies, were filled with men who were fiercely loyal to the British crown. And all they had to do was to march inland, land on the coast, march inland, raise the king's standard, rally the troops, train them, outfit them, and then march north and attack George Washington from the south with an army of Americans. Now, on the day after Christmas 1779, Sir Henry Clinton, that's General Sir Henry Clinton, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in North America, sailed out of New York Harbor with a flotilla of ships on board, which was just such an army. But these were not British regulars. These were British Legion Americans, men concerned about their rights as Englishmen and dearly concerned about what would happen to their rights as Englishmen should these upstart patriots, these Whig rebels, actually win the war. So these men from Connecticut and New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania joined the King's Army. They trained to fight. They wore uniforms and they sailed out of New York Harbor on December 26, 1779. Now, the waters off the coast of North Carolina were unkind to Sir Henry Clinton's ships. He lost ships, he lost ordnance, he lost ammunition, he lost horses. Some of his ships were blown to the Bahamas. A trip that usually took 10 days took 5 weeks. But in early February, his ships began to straggle in off the coast of Georgia. They began to turn around at the mouth of Savannah River. They turned around at Tybee Island. They sailed back towards South Carolina. They offloaded their men onto James Island. They marched inland. They surrounded Charlestown, the 4th largest city in the American colonies. They laid siege to the city, and on May 12th of 1780, the city surrendered. And when General Benjamin Lincoln, commander of the Southern Department of the Continental Army, surrendered those 5,000 Continental soldiers, that remained the largest surrender of an American fighting force to a foreign power until World War II. Now, that's the way I usually begin my programs on the American Revolution in the South, but not today. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am delighted to be here in Lenoir at the Caldwell Heritage Museum, and I can assure you I am a poor substitute for Senator Jim Broyhill. I have heard his presentation, and I know you would have enjoyed having him today, but I'm honored that he asked me to substitute on his behalf, and I will try to give you my rendition of the story that he tells so well and so eloquently. Now, I appreciate the invitation or the introduction by Beverly Beale, and I appreciate the help of all those who have gotten me started here this morning. And I appreciate each and every one of you coming here today to hear what I might have to say about an episode of American history that is near and dear to my heart, and one that I hope will be of continuing interest to you after today's presentation, and that is the Battle of Kings Mountain. You know, there are a handful of battles that claim to be the turning point of the American Revolution, but let's look at what a person of no less standing than Thomas Jefferson had to say on the topic. Thomas Jefferson said that the Battle of Kings Mountain was that joyful annunciation of the turn of the tide of success, which terminated the Revolutionary War with the seal of our independence. Now, I'm not suggesting that that resolves the entire matter, but it certainly gives the Battle of Kings Mountain some substantial standing in that continuing conversation about what was the turning point of the American Revolution. Well, it was so important that the Battle of Kings Mountain is commemorated today by 2 units of the National Park Service. The Kings Mountain National Military Park, just over the line in South Carolina, and of course, the Over Mountain Victory National Historic Trail, which comes right through here in Lenoir. Now, the Over Mountain Victory National Historic Trail is the landscape on which I'm going to be telling the story that I want to share with you this morning. And you probably already know the geography, but a lot of my audiences don't, so let me just share briefly with you. The trail is the commemorative trail is 330 miles, and it lies in 4 states. It has a trailhead up here at Abingdon, Virginia, and another trailhead in Elkin, and then they combine at Morganton and come down to Kings Mountain National Military Park. And you can see that most of the trail lies in North Carolina, and when you consider that at the time of the march, what is now Tennessee was North Carolina. It is truly a North Carolina story. And if we can just get South Carolina to move their border a little bit farther, we can have the whole thing. But I don't think that's going to happen. Now, this is the landscape on which the story takes place. It's a gathering of backcountry militiamen from the Overmountain area and from the Yadkin Valley. They convened at what's today's Morganton, and then they proceeded on south toward what became the Battle of Kings Mountain. But in the telling of the story, here's the geography that I'll be sharing with you. They started in Abingdon, which at the time was known as Abington, incorporated in 1780. Sycamore Shoals is in today's Elizabethton, Tennessee. That's the Sycamore Shoals State Historic Area. Yellow Mountain Gap. Yellow Mountain is adjacent to Roan Mountain State Park. It's on the state line between North Carolina and Tennessee. Grassy Creek is today's Spruce Pine, and it comes up, the headwaters of Grassy Creek are at the Blue Ridge Parkway. Of course, the Yadkin River flows to the northeast, and so these men were coming northeast from Elkin, and there they gathered at Quaker Meadows, which was the home of Colonel Charles McDowell and his brother Major Joseph McDowell, and that Quaker Meadows is in today's Morganton. From there they pursued and continued on to Gilberttown, a community that does not exist anymore, but it is just immediately northeast and outside of today's Rutherfordton. And then the ford at Green River in the Broad River Basin, and then the cow pens, which it's the same site as a later battle that is commemorated there as well, a battle in January of 1781, but it's the same pasture site in this story as where the battle took place a few months later, and then of course Kings Mountain National Military Park. I wrote my book, Before They Were Heroes at Kings Mountain, that you see on the table over here, just to answer one primary question: why were these men able to do this heroic thing of mustering in the Overmountain area, marching over the mountains and pursuing Patrick Ferguson for 2 weeks? And the simple answer is because they did it all the time. When you look back 6 years in the history of some of these men, from 1774 to 1780, you see them involved in all of these other campaigns. And so that's what my book involves. It starts in 1774 with some of the same men who fought at Kings Mountain campaigning down the rugged Kanawha River under Colonel Andrew Lewis to fight against the Cornstalk and the Shawnee at the Battle of Point Pleasant. It includes the Battle of Great Bridge, the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge, Rutherford's expedition against the Cherokee. A lot of the men who were at Kings Mountain were experienced in fighting against the Cherokee. Not necessarily a proud moment in American history, but that was their experience that led to what they did later. And then all of the conflict in South Carolina. The British captured Charlestown, and at that point, Sir Henry Clinton decided that this would be a good time for him to return to New York, and where he would find the amenities of 13 colonies much more to his liking. And so he put in charge of the mop-up operation, having captured the 4th largest city in the American colonies, his second in command, Lieutenant General Charles, Lord Cornwallis, a man whom he despised, and the feeling was mutual. But before Sir Henry Clinton left, he knew that he would need someone to be in charge of rallying these backcountry loyalists and training them and outfitting them and preparing them to march north and attack George Washington from the south. So he created a new position called Inspector General of the Militia of Georgia and the Carolinas. And he assigned those responsibilities to an experienced and very capable officer, Major Patrick Ferguson. Well, Cornwallis, after hanging around Charlestown as long as he possibly could, having sent men out ahead to arrange supply depots, he begins to march north. His right flank to the east is protected by Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton, and his left flank, sweeping through the western part of South Carolina, is protected by Major Patrick Ferguson. Now, as they sweep north, they are harassed by the Patriot militia in many, many different battles through the summer of 1780. And then at the Battle of Camden, the reconstituted Southern Department of the Continental Army under Horatio Gates is marching south, and Lord Cornwallis is marching north. In the wee hours of the morning of August 16th, the two lead groups bump into each other, and they retreat till dawn, and they come back together in what is a colossal defeat for the Patriots. In fact, Horatio Gates jumped on his horse, abandoned his men on the battlefield, and rode for 3 days to get to Hillsborough. And at that point, there was no army standing between Lord Cornwallis and his plans to march north and attack George Washington from the south. Major Patrick Ferguson to the west sweeps into North Carolina, crossing in on September 7th. Ferguson advances there. He's foraging to feed Cornwallis's large army. And he had one of his loyalists, Lieutenant Anthony Allaire, was keeping a diary, and he made note of his encounters in the Broad River Valley, and he wrote, "The poor deluded people of this province begin to be sensible to their error, and they come in quickly." On another day, Anthony Allaire wrote, "This settlement is composed of the most violent rebels I ever saw, especially the young ladies." Well, about this time, Patrick Ferguson had had his fill of these backcountry patriots coming over and harassing him as he was trying to sweep north. And he was headquartered in Gilberttown, and he took a prisoner, someone he had captured at the Battle of Musgrove Mill, a man by the name of Sam Phillips. And he sent Sam Phillips with a message to these over mountain men. And the message was simple: "If you do not desist your opposition to the British arms, I shall march this army over the mountains, hang your leaders, and lay waste your country with fire and sword." And that's what brings us to the story. Sam Phillips left Gilberttown, and he made his way, wounded as he was, through the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, crossing over the Appalachians and finding his distant cousin Isaac Shelby in today's Bristol. He shared with him the message from Patrick Ferguson. Isaac Shelby considered the challenge for a day, and then he got on his horse and he rode 40 miles to confer with another militia, Colonel John Sevier. The two men conferred for a day, and then they decided that the only reasonable course of action was to turn the tables and make the would-be hunter the hunted. They would gather together an army of militiamen. They would cross the mountains, and they would attack Patrick Ferguson before he could bring his army over the mountains into their homeland. They sent out messengers. Riders rode far and wide. They would gather at Sycamore Shoals on September 25th, 1780. Isaac Shelby brought 240 men. John Sevier brought 240 men. There were another 160 who were already there from Burke County and Rutherford County under the command of Charles McDowell and Andrew Hampton. These men had attacked Patrick Ferguson at the Battle of Cane Creek on September 12th, and then they had escaped over the mountains to the safety. They were there. And then William Campbell came down from Virginia with 200 men. There they were at Sycamore Shoals with 800 men, some on foot, some on horseback. Some of them had brought their families. They stitched together clothing and saddle, and they prepared themselves to go off to battle. The women, the husband, the wives, the daughters, the sisters came to prepare these men to go off. Now, one of the things they needed most of all was gunpowder. And there was a woman there by the name of Mary Patton, and Mary Patton knew how to make gunpowder. And she had a powder mill, and she gave to these men 500 pounds of gunpowder. When a pound of gunpowder cost $1, and $1 would buy you an acre of land. It was a substantial and important gift to the cause of liberty that she made. They were gathered on the morning of September 26th. Reverend Samuel Doak gave them a prayer, and then he gave them in his sermon their battle cry, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." And then as the men turned to begin their walk over the mountains, they heard some voices out in the trees, and they stopped. And here came 200 more Virginians under the command of Arthur Campbell, the cousin and brother-in-law of William Campbell. He left those 200 men under William Campbell's command, and then he turned and went back to Montgomery County, where he and other Whig militia were to protect the lead mines, which were being attacked by Tory militia in the area. Well, the men left on September 26th, and they took with them a herd of beef cattle to feed themselves on this campaign. But the beeves slowed them down so much that they were only 5 miles from the starting point by noon, but they persevered, and by the end of the day, they reached the Doe River, the resting place. This was the first flat spot with water that you came to when you came from the east over the Yellow Mountain Gap. And so they camped there. And it began to rain. They took their precious gunpowder and they put it under an overhanging rock called Shelving Rock that is still there today. Now, these men slept through the night. None of them had a tent. And in the morning, officers realized that the cattle were going to slow them down so much that they ordered the men to slaughter a few cattle and prepare rations for 2 days. And they filled their wallets with 2 days of food. And then some of the men took the cattle back to Sycamore Shoals. And then they began their ascent toward Yellow Mountain Gap. They went up by Bright's Trace. It was an old horse trail, an Indian track, a buffalo trace, a deer track. 1,000 men, some on foot, some on horseback, slogging up this side of this mountain the day after it had rained. But they finally got to the top, and when they did, they found that what had been rain down below had turned to snow. And they found themselves standing in snow recalled as shoe-mouth deep. Well, the officers had the men stop and fire their muskets, and some of the men recalled later that the report of the rifle was softer at the higher elevations than when they were out hunting down in the valleys. And they also counted off the men, and they discovered that 2 men were missing, James Crawford and Samuel Chambers. Now, these were men who had mustered under John Sevier. They were from the Nolichucky Valley, and because they were from the Nolichucky Valley, it was decided and feared that they might have loyalist leanings. And they thought maybe these men had mustered with the Patriots, come to the top of the mountain, and now had run ahead to warn Patrick Ferguson that this army of 1,000 men was coming after him. But they had no choice but to continue on. They descended halfway down the mountain. They camped that night. The next day, they continued down the North Toe River, and they came to the mouth of Grassy Creek at today's Spruce Pine. They made camp. And the next morning, on the 4th day, they went up Grassy Creek, and there they came to the precipice of the Blue Ridge, the Catawba Valley sweeping out before them. And there they had a decision to make, for there were 2 routes to go down that mountain. And it was feared that if they all went down one way, Patrick Ferguson might come up the other, and then there would be no one between him and their homes and his marauding and burning, which he had promised to do. But the other decision, the other choice, was to divide their army in the face of an equal enemy, and that was a military blunder of the first order, but that was a decision these brave men had to make. They divided their armies, and fortunately they made their way down. They camped that night at Turkey Cove and North Cove without running into Patrick Ferguson. The next day they united along the Catawba River, and they marched into Quaker Meadows. They arrived on September 30th. And there their spirits were heartily lifted, for coming through and across the meadow were 350 more militiamen that had come up the Yadkin River under the command of Major Joseph Winston from Surrey County and Colonel Benjamin Cleveland from Wilkes County. And now they had 1,400 men. The next morning on October 1st, they crossed over the Catawba River at Greenleaf Ford, and they headed south because they knew that Patrick Ferguson was at Gilberttown. Well, about halfway through that next day, it began to rain, and the men had to stop. The officers had everybody stop. It was just too much mud. And so they stopped and they made camp. Not a man had a tent. Making camp meant standing under an evergreen bough and waiting for the rain to stop. Well, it continued to rain on October 2nd. And again, they did not march. Well, these were not men with a military discipline, and some of them nearly came to blows. And on the night of October 2nd, the officers knew that they needed to do something. And so they had a war council. They knew if they were going to go fight Patrick Ferguson on October 4th in Gilberttown, they would need a general commander. And Charles McDowell volunteered to ride to Hillsborough to get General Horatio Gates to send them a general. They hoped to get Daniel Morgan or William Davidson if they were available. But Isaac Shelby, then 29 years old and the youngest among them, said, "We're on our way to catch Ferguson. We don't have time for that." And so he made a proposal. He proposed that William Campbell be the general commander. After all, he had come the farthest. He had brought the most men. But what Isaac Shelby really knew but did not say was that William Campbell was the only colonel there not from North Carolina. And by selecting him, they could avoid all the petty jealousies which would surely erupt among all the other colonels. So William Campbell became the general commander, and on the morning of October 3rd, they mustered outside at Bedford Hill, where they had rested for that day and a half. They paraded the men, and they all gave them a chance to turn around and go back home. You'd been away from home for a week now. There will be no judgment if you turn and go back. Not a single man budged. They heartily cheered their courage, and they marched down Cane Creek. At the end of that day, they learned that Patrick Ferguson was no longer in Gilberttown. Remember those two spies, James Crawford and Samuel Chambers? They had indeed come over the mountains. They had found Patrick Ferguson and warned him that this army of 1,000 militiamen was coming after him. And now Patrick Ferguson was on the move. But these over-mountain men and the backcountry patriots did not know which direction he had gone. Was he headed toward Charlotte and the protection of Cornwallis, or was he headed toward 96 and Colonel John Kruger? Well, they decided that he must be going toward 96 because that's where he had just come from. And so they pursued him to the southwest. And at the end of the day of October 5th, they found themselves at the ford of Green River. And they had completely lost the trail. They had no idea which way Patrick Ferguson had gone. Meanwhile, 20 miles to the east, there was a group of South Carolina militia who had heard about this gathering of over-mountain men, and they were looking to join up. And they had just had a spy come back in and tell them that Patrick Ferguson was headed toward Charlotte town. And so they sent one of their riders who rode through the night to find the over-mountain men and steer them to the east. His name was Edward Lacey. He was not familiar with the countryside. He took a guide with him, a man that he thought he could trust. But twice along that ride, the midnight ride of Edward Lacey, he twice pulled his pistol ready to dispatch the man, for he thought the man was leading him astray. But he stumbled into the sentries around the encampment at the ford at Green River. Now, these men did not know this colonel from South Carolina. They blindfolded him. They took him into the encampment. None of the officers there knew him. But through his own character and demeanor, he was able to convince them that he brought them true news. And that's when the Patriots changed their plans. They told all the men who had horses or who could get them by morning to be ready to ride. They would divide their army into horsemen and foot soldiers. And they would gather with the South Carolina militia at a place called the Cowpens. So they, on the morning of October 5th, they rode out of the basin of the Broad River, got on a ridge line, and they crossed into South Carolina, and they rode hard all day for 22 miles, and they arrived at the Cowpens. Now, the Cowpens was a place where people brought their cattle to fatten them up before they went off to market. It was owned by a man named Saunders. He was a loyalist. And here he had 1,400 militiamen, now 1,800. He had No response except, yes, sir. Well, he told them he had no news about Ferguson coming through there. And these men were hungry. They slaughtered some of Saunders' cattle. They dotted the field with campfires. They made a good meal. Some people say they harvested 50 acres of corn to feed themselves and their horses. And while they were there, the sun had gone down. Another South Carolina spy came into the encampment. His name was Joseph Carr. Now, Joseph Carr was 19, and he had had a deformity of some sort of his leg, which enabled him to disarm the suspicions of other people. And he had infiltrated Ferguson's camp at Tate's Plantation. He had sat around the campfire, and he had listened carefully to their plans, and then he faded into the shadows of the woods and got on his horse and he rode until he found his men at the cow pens. And he brought them news that Patrick Ferguson was on his way to Charlottetown on a road by the way of Kings Mountain. And then the Patriots knew their challenge. He was still 35 miles away. They had been in the saddle for 2 weeks. They had been in the saddle for 22 miles that day, and the only choice they could make was to catch him the next day. For if they didn't catch him the next day, he would be too close to Charlotte and all those reinforcements, or he would be within a day's ride of reinforcements coming out to escort him in. And so the officers walked through the encampments at cow pens. They picked the 900 best marksmen. They put them on the 900 sturdiest horses. And at 9 o'clock at night, those 900 men rode out, intending to ride 35 miles through the night to reach Ferguson on the road by way of Kings Mountain. It was cold, it was dark, and it began to rain. Some of the men took off their hunting frocks and wrapped them around their rifles to keep their rifles dry and their powder dry. It rained so hard the roads were muddy. Some of them got lost, and they were only 5 miles from the camp when the sun came up. They had to ride that much harder to catch up with the others. They forded the broad river at Cherokee Ford. The night's rain had caused the river to start to rise. The men on some of the men on the sturdiest horses went out into the river to break the current. All the men made their way across. Not a single man took a ducking. They got to the other side and they marched on for a while, and then the officers began to confer with each other from their saddles. These men had not eaten in so long. Some of them had missed a meal and they were tired. The horses were tired, and we needed to stop and rest. And Isaac Shelby rode in and he heard what they were saying, and he said, "I will not stop until night if I have to follow Ferguson into Cornwallis's lines." Not another officer said a word. They rode back to the heads of their command and they rode on. Now, these men, these 900 men on horseback, got some more information as they got closer to Kings Mountain. And at one particular house they stopped, and the men there were of no help at all. But as they were about to ride away, a young girl came out from the house. And whether she was impressed by one of the men on horseback or all 900, we don't know. But she came to William Campbell, and she said, "How many of you are there?" "Enough to whip Ferguson if we can find him." And she turned and she pointed toward Little Kings Mountain, and she said, "He is on that hill." Well, they rode on. Now, the night of October 6th, it had rained everywhere. And at Little Kings Mountain, Patrick Ferguson had encircled his wagons on top of the hill and made no other defenses. He had sent a message that he was the king of Kings Mountain, and God Almighty and all of his angels could not remove him from it. And perhaps Patrick Ferguson took some comfort that night in the company of Virginia Sal and Virginia Paul, two good-looking women, it was reported, supposed to be his mistresses, but working nominally as his cooks. On the afternoon of October 7th, the sun came out. The Patriots were getting closer to the Little Kings Mountain. The night's rain had worked to their advantage. It had softened the ground, and the clop of the hooves couldn't be heard. They did not raise a cloud of dust. They were able to get within a quarter mile of the hill before they were even seen. They tied up their horses, and they tied to their horses their blankets and their hunting frocks. And they took with them into battle only what they would need: their rifles, their shot, their powder, their tomahawks, and their hunting knives. And the final command went out: "Put fresh prime in your guns, boys, and every man go into battle resolved to fight until he dies." They broke into two lines, and they encircled King's Mountain. They turned and they faced the hill. The war and the world were about to change. It was Saturday, October 7th, 1780, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Now that's where I usually stop the story, because I can't tell the story of the battle that same way, because in the course of writing this book, these men became my friends, and I know what happens to them on the next page. But it's in the book, and it's well written, if I may say. But I will struggle to share more with you. The Patriots encircled Little King's Mountain before they were even seen, and they began to charge up the hill. These militiamen had their rifles. Rifles were accurate to 300 yards, but it took a minute to load each shot. The Loyalists on top were outfitted with muskets. And these muskets could be loaded and fired 4 times in a minute, but they were only accurate for about 80 yards. But they had bayonets. And there were more people killed and wounded with edged swords in the American Revolution than by a bullet. It was an unlucky man who was shot during the American Revolution. Every man consider himself an officer and act from his own judgment. They began to ascend the mountain, running up the face. "Now, boys, quickly reload your rifles. Let's advance upon them and give them a hell of a fire." They charged up the sides of the mountains. When they got toward the top, the Loyalist militia came out. They fired, and then they chased the Patriots down the side of the mountain with their bayonets. And these men, desperately trying to reload, ran down the hill. And that's where our freedom comes from. Because at the bottom of that hill, these men turned around and went back up that hill in the face of cold steel. "Now let us at it again." And they charged back up. 3 times they charged up. Twice they retreated. "Yonder is your enemy and the enemy of all mankind." When they got close to the top, they saw Patrick Ferguson. He could be easily spotted for his checkered duster, which he used to cover his uniform. And as he rode around, blowing on a silver whistle, trying to give commands to his Loyalist militia, he became an easy target himself. And at one point he was about to give up hope, we think. He was either riding toward the line or trying to ride through it. But he was spotted by a young man named Gilliland. And Gilliland took aim and he clicked the trigger and had a misfire. And he turned to his father-in-law, 62-year-old Robert Young. Robert Young had a rifle that he called by the same name that he called his wife. "Let's see what Sweet Lips can do." And he pulled, and the ball hit Patrick Ferguson, knocked him out of his saddle. His foot hung in the stirrup, and the horse panicked and dragged him around the top of the mountain. And when the horse was finally stopped, Patrick Ferguson had 9 musket balls in him. The men continued to climb up the mountains, firing toward the Loyalists. The second in command, Abraham de Peyster, was trying to surrender, but it was a confused situation with militia who continued to fire. And it took a while to get the Patriots to stop shooting these Loyalists who had put down their weapons. And Abraham de Peyster said, "It's damned unfair. And then after the battle, they began to bury the dead, but it was done poorly and hastily. 26 patriots were killed. The others were, they left the loyalists to their own devices. The patriots dead were buried hurriedly under logs and pieces of bark. It was feared that if they waited any longer, that Colonel Bannister Tarleton might arrive with his Green Dragoons and their cavalry and their sabers, and so they were eager to get away from Kings Mountain. And so they marched out on the morning of October 8th with 800 Loyalist prisoners, each of them carrying a rifle or two, a musket or two, with the flints removed, and they marched them away from the battlefield. Now, I want to share this with you because this is the most amazing thing, I think. The valor of these men at Kings Mountain was remembered years later, decades later, in the early 1800s. That monument that you see there in the corner was erected on July 4th, 1814 by Dr. William McLean to honor 4 men from the South Fork of the Catawba River in today's Belmont and Mount Holly area in Gaston County. Major William Chronicle, Captain John Maddox, William Rabb, and John Boyd were the 4 men, and their names were on that monument to the left. It was made out of blue slate, and it eroded severely during its first 100 years. And a replica marker was put up in 1914. It says, to the sacred to the memory of Major William Chronicle, Captain John Maddox, William Rabb, and John Boyd, who were killed at this place on the 7th of October, 1780, fighting in defense of America. That marker is the second oldest Revolutionary War marker in the country. And it's right here at Kings Mountain. Questions? I got some other slides I could show you, but I'll give you a break. Here. Yes, sir.
Did you say that they came to a point at the bottom of the hill about a quarter mile from their objective? Is that what I recall you saying? And to gather to start their assault?
The question relates to a specific movement in the battle. The men did get close to the bottom of the mountain where they stopped and they tied up their horses. Whether it was a quarter mile, it's.
I heard quarter mile.
I said quarter mile. I'm not going to.
I would point out to you that for those local folks, Caldwell Memorial Hospital is about a quarter mile from here. So if this is the hill, then that would be how far they were away. That's no small feat to come that much distance. Quarter mile is farther than it seems.
Yeah, and they were seen. The Virginia militia were the ones who suffered the most casualties because they first encountered some of Ferguson's sharpshooters. He had some men, and it's still a contested issue. Ferguson had invented a rifle called the Ferguson rifle, which was a breech-loading rifle. You didn't load it through the muzzle. It was a breech-loader. And he was not allowed to use it because the upper echelons of the military said poo-poo on that. So he was not allowed to have it, but it's suspected parts of that rifle have been found at the hill. So there are people that believe that Ferguson had some of Ferguson's rifles there. There are other people that say, no, that's a part that's to a rifle that's similar. So you're going to hear it both ways. But Ferguson was a good soldier, and if his superiors told him not to take the rifle, he probably wouldn't have. But he was he was probably the best soldier out there. But he was the only British soldier there. Everyone else who fought at that battle on the British side was an American, a loyalist. And they were all patriot Americans on the other side. Everybody at that battle was an American, except for Patrick Ferguson. So when you talk about the Southern campaign, you're talking about a civil war, brother against brother, father against son, neighbor against neighbor. And one of the more interesting aspects of that we can appreciate living here in the South is that nobody knew who was going to win. And there were families that said, we got to have somebody on the winning side. And they would split their sons. You fight for the Loyalists, you fight for the Patriots. And, of course, at the Battle of Kings Mountain, you've got the famous story of the Goforth brothers who shot and killed each other with the same shot. So, yes, ma'am?
When they made the decision to take the 900 ahead on horses to go up to the mountain, and they left, of course, many behind, after the battle, when they had 800 basically prisoner of war loyalists, where did they go? Did they go back and rejoin the others that were at Cowpens, or what happened after the battle?
Well, that's a wonderful question about what happened after the battle, and I should clarify that the 900 men on horseback are the ones that got to the battle and engaged in the battle. And on the next morning, as they were marching away, here come the foot soldiers. So the foot soldiers had as hurriedly as they could, had come over from Cowpens. And so now you had all of these men who were then in a position to help guard the 800 prisoners. And the 800 prisoners very quickly became the 700 prisoners, the 600 prisoners, the 500 prisoners. People were escaping. Some were being slaughtered. You had a lot of grievances among neighbors that were getting solved off to the side of the trail. It's not a happy story, but it's one that's going to be told, and there are several local communities that are interested in having that part of the story told as well. And I should say it's in my book. So. You had a question. I'm sorry. Didn't mean to pass you over.
You kind of answered it.
Oh, good.
Well, I just wanted to clarify. So basically, the reason that the Americans chose the Loyalist side was because they wanted both sides, they wanted to cover themselves up depending upon who won?
The question relates to why did many Americans in the South choose the Loyalist side? You know, a lot of it was because they thought that they wanted to maintain their rights as Englishmen. And Great Britain was the big power in the world, and who did not want to be an Englishman? And here were these upstarts saying, we want to be independent. Well, independence came with nothing. You know, you're giving up your rights as an Englishman in the world. That's a pretty scary thing to do. So the people who went to the Loyalist side were those who favored the status quo, the way things had always been. And you can put whatever label you want on to it, but we you know, there's that group, people that like the way things are and don't want to mess with it. And then you've got people who want to stir up the pot a little bit and do something different. We have that today. We had that then. But the primary reason was politics. It was probably only a few where families divided their sons. But after the surrender of Charlestown and the Southern Department had been completely wiped out, and then it got wiped out again at Camden, it was a no-brainer who was going to win. So, and here was Ferguson saying, I'll give you a rifle, come fight with me. So it was an easy decision for the people to get on the Loyalist side. But after the Battle of Kings Mountain, it became very difficult for Cornwallis to recruit any more Loyalists. It was a game changer. After people saw in the back country that these militiamen had done this, everybody wants to be a winner. Everybody wanted to jump over and be a patriot, and they did. You know, the patriot ranks increased, and so after the Battle of Kings Mountain, you had November and December when Cornwallis had retreated to Winnsboro, South Carolina, to recover from yellow fever. And that period of time, when he was wintering over in South Carolina, allowed the Patriots to strengthen themselves. It allowed Nathaniel Greene to come down and get Daniel Morgan in position, and that's why the Battle of Cowpens occurred as it did. Cornwallis said, well, I feel good. I'm ready to start out now. And he sends Bannister Tarleton over there, and Bannister Tarleton's about as arrogant as anybody could be. And he got whooped by Daniel Morgan. So the Battle of Kings Mountain was a victory on that day, but it was also a very strategic victory for the whole war. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the British cavalry Colonel Tarleton. He's depicted in documentaries as a terrorist who massacred civilians and massacred wounded soldiers. Is his reputation as bad as it seems to be in documentaries?
The question relates to Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton, and was he as bad as he is depicted in the documentaries? And the short answer is yes. He did all of those bad things that he did. He was just a true believer in Great Britain's military might and his family. He had already squandered a fortune, and so his family purchased a commission for him at 24 and sent him off to America. And he just, he was bad. And the sad thing is, he lived through the war and wrote his memoirs and ended up being an elected member of the parliament or something. It's just not fair. As Abraham de Peister said, damned unfair. Yes, ma'am.
For those of you who do not know, my shameless plug for Child, William Lenore helped to raise a large number of men out in Happy Valley who would march down to Franklin Meadows. And once they got to Franklin Meadows, he was one of those who turned his company equipment over to someone else and rode ahead to meet up with Ferguson at Kings Mountain. He was actually wounded twice. He was shot in his left arm, he was shot in his side. Clothing was riddled with about 8 different musket ball holes as well. He actually wrote and he talked about how minor he considered his wounds compared to the humbling experience of having had his cue or his ponytail shot in his head about where it was time. So I just wanted to point out that William Lenore was right there in the heat of the battle. He fell in, I believe, with Winston's command. Am I not right on that?
Correct, he did.
Winston's command. So he was right in the heat of the battle. So I just wanted to give a little segue there to I want to go over time, but I do want to show you some pictures that relate to Senator Broyhill and things that happened later. And whoever was helping me with this, who's our tech person? I need to start another slideshow. It's already up here. So, yes, sir, you had a question.
Could you comment on the loyalist patriot dynamics in the South versus the North? Was it the same in the North, or
just get it on the screen so I can. There were loyalists in the North as well, and they had already picked sides. You remember the British Legion. These men from Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey, they had already been fighting for a year or so with alongside the British. So the country was really divided, and the notion that everybody wanted to break away from Great Britain and be independent. Did that answer? It's not a satisfactory answer. There's a lot to be said about the Tory. Oh, y'all, thank you. I hope they were going to get it back then.
While they're working on that, so you can present those photographs, let me cover a couple points, and we'll we can be more interested. These ladies, thank you, ladies, very much. A couple of things. Did you sign the Get Well card? If you did not, Myra Dixon will have it back there at the desk, and so you can sign as you go out. We have a township calendar. You may want to put arrange for entries on it, and you may want to be ready to buy the township calendar. There's a flyer on it. The mayor, I think, is holding it up right now as we speak, so you can get that information. Please sign. Some of you did not sign the FOIA registrar. That's a very important thing for us. And so if you didn't sign the FOIA registrar, Jan Bumgarner out there will point it out to you and help you sign that. The next presentation is with Jeannie Klein in October. I believe it's October the 14th. Jeannie is right here and has written a book recently, a local girl, talk about local people. We talked about my brother and everything he said was true. Growing up. Password. Oh, ours? 28645. Well, I shouldn't have said that on that. Are there any soldiers present? I know there's at least two. Please stand up and raise your hand. Now, Professor, you need to realize that there's a colonel in the room. Colonel Malcolm McCarl, retired, right here, United States Army. Malcolm, please stand up. Colonel.
That's it. That's it. Just
I
start.
was in radio once upon a time. You can't have dead air.
Sorry, there's nothing on here, so
Yeah. Also. Yeah.
Yeah, just
Just
give me a second.
it's go to slideshow, and say.
yeah, I got
For
it.
those of
Okay.
you that are wondering what's going on, there's nothing on this screen.
Sorry.
So we're having to...
That's fine. Yeah.
Sorry, I just added.
Just slideshow up at the top menu.
I'm gonna try and maximize it. This is like what in that.
No, slideshow, center of the top menu.
Yeah, I just
Now
maximizing the
F5.
screen so I can see it.
I can F5 it.
Okay, just do that.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, just real quickly, Senator Broyhill is really the one who was responsible for the Over Mountain Victory National Historic Trail being designated by Congress. And this year is the 40th anniversary of the first march of the Over Mountain Victory Trail. And then it was a 5-year effort to get Congress to designate that. And, 5 years, that's about right, I guess, for congressional action. But the march began in 1975 at Sycamore Shoals, and it was a group of citizens that just wanted to do something special for the bicentennial. America had bicentennial fever, and so they began at Sycamore Shoals. Rip Collins was the Grand Marshal that year. As some of you know, Bob Benner. He was there in 75 from this area. He put up the trail markers, and there's a picture of him from 2005. Then these are pictures from the very first march, 1975, out of the newspaper. There's Bill Stronach on the left, carrying somebody on his shoulders. There's a group of marchers coming down Highway 18, and over to the right is Harry J. Smith, who was the safety marshal during the first year, and the second year he was the Grand Marshal. And you can see that that first year, people weren't very accurate in their period dress. Not at all. And we weren't in good shape either, I can see. Those are some students on the right, and it was raining that day, so they get forgiveness there. Tom Gray was from Tennessee, and he was instrumental in the trail over around Sycamore Shoals. Ivy Moore, how many of you know Ivy Moore from Wilkesboro? He played the part of Daniel Boone in the Daniel Boone wagon train back in the 60s. That picture in the upper right-hand corner, he was the chief scout and the Daniel Boone wagon train. But then along that trail during the late 70s, as we were marching the OVT every fall, there was a petition to get Congress to designate it a National Historic Trail, and people all along the trail signed it, and so we still have that scroll. There was a series of articles that were published in the Winston-Salem Journal. Lou Bonds was the reporter, and he started his march at Fort Defiance and then continued all the way to Kings Mountain, so we've got that record. And this is the picture I wanted to show you. 1975, this is a 156-pound sheet cake here in Lenoir, done in the shape of the Bennington flag, which is 13 stripes and the circle of stars with a 76 in the middle. And this, you can see the cook right there. She's putting some frosting on it. So there was a big parade right here in Lenoir in 1975 as the first group of marchers came through from Fort Defiance. When they got to Morganton, there was a big rally with country music and bluegrass music there at the fairgrounds. And then they got to Kings Mountain, North Carolina. Kings Mountain was celebrating its centennial, and so the notion came up. Mayor John Henry Moss wanted to invite the President of the United States to come down there and celebrate, and so he asked Jim Broyhill if he would extend that invitation, and Jim Broyhill and Gerald Ford had been colleagues together in the House of Representatives, and so he went to President Ford and said, "Are you still coming?" And he said, "Yes, I'll be there." And then, as you know, in September of 75, there were some shots fired in the pavement in the vicinity of Gerald Ford, and so the Secret Service said, "You're not going anywhere. Let's send Nelson Rockefeller." So he's a vice president. Send him. So he shows up at Kings Mountain. He greets the crowd, and he's there at John Gamble Stadium. And the marchers that had started in Sycamore Shoals were carrying a Bible, a scroll, and a hunting horn. And so they blew the hunting horn one last time, and then they handed the horn to Vice President Rockefeller. And he said to the audience, he said, "This is one of the luckiest days in my life, and quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, this is America at its best." So that's what he said on that occasion. And then through 76, and they continued the march. And Gary Everhart, another Lenoir native, was the director of the National Park Service that year. He came to Kings Mountain, gave a talk. And there's one of my favorite pictures, Bill Stronach and Representative James T. Broyhill, appropriately dressed as we thought at the time. And they were talking about introducing the legislation to create the Over Mountain Victory Trail, so 77. And then there were continuing marches in 78 and 79. And then in 1980, President Carter signed the Over Mountain Victory Trail bill, and it became a law, and the trail was designated just in time for the 200th anniversary. And Senator loves that picture. Every time I show that, he just laughs about that. And then in 1980, they had the big dedication at Kings Mountain. The Over Mountain Victory Trail people walked in with their banner. It was a huge turnout, I understand. And Gary Everhart, Jim Broyhill, and Harry Smith, all being connected to the trail and the history of the trail, the origin of the trail, and they all grew up here in Lenoir, and they all went to high school together. And I took this picture of them in 2005. And then just last year, as Mayor Joseph Giddens was there, and we had a dedication at Fort Grider, not Crider. Okay, Fort Grider. And then this is a display that's in Wilkesboro. You know, the senator there with the Over Mountain Victory National Historic Trail, and I credit him. He was the one responsible for getting it designated. So this past summer, I asked him if he wanted to send something special to Jimmy Carter. So we created this plaque that includes 2 of the commemorative coins, just like the ones that you had last year. And we sent that plaque to President Carter at the Carter Center, and he wrote back to Senator Broyhill with a nice note with a signature on that. So that has just been accomplished, and I'm so proud that he wanted to do that and was able to do that, and that we actually heard back. So, huzzah! And I have copies of my books and other books over here that I'd be glad to have you look at, and I'd be glad to autograph them. This is the Before They Were Heroes at Kings Mountain, award-winning book. I have a guide to the Over Mountain Victory National Historic Trail. And then I want to call your attention to this book in particular, Before Liberty. This is a book that was written during the bicentennial by Roy Thompson, a reporter for the Winston-Salem Journal. He wrote a feature article each week that was published from July of 1975 to July of 1976, and then he put them together in this book. It was very popular. This is a second printing, January 1977. This physical book has been in his widow's basement for 38 years. And I'm helping her get them into the hands of school teachers for free, but you are welcome to purchase one for your own. If you don't want to buy it, you can read the stories free online, 1 week at a time. But if you just can't wait, they're all here. And then I've got my book on the life of Daniel Boone. This is not my book, but it's a wonderful read, and I pointed out to the ladies, this is the story of Rebecca Boone. It's done in her voice. It's historical fiction, but this is the story of what was going on in the pioneer backcountry while Daniel was away, and she had all the kids and the farm and everything to take care of, It's a wonderfully written account of the woman's experience during the pioneer era. And then, of course, I have Scoundrels, Rogues, and Heroes of the Old North State, stories about some of North Carolina's more colorful characters. Thank you all so much. I was delighted to be here with you today.
He's there to answer questions and to show you the books, and we do appreciate him, and we appreciate Senator Broyhill for making the arrangements. He saw this occur. He was not going to let us down. We do appreciate that very much. Please, yes, sir. Steve Austin.
Yeah, we lived in Cleveland County for about 30 years, and we went to the King Mountain Battleground several times. And if you've not been down there, it is a wonderful place. A great wall. All the signage, the monuments, all these things he's talking about, Ferguson, and you kind of get an understanding of their history, not like I am. You need to make that little drive down to King Mountain Battleground. It's a beautiful place and great wall.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. So here's the plan. We will rally there, you will lead us, and we'll charge.
There you go. This is for the senator. Everybody look here and wave. Send him well wishes here. Raise your hand there. Everybody look here. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm Bill Tate with Caldwell County Now and Then, and I am pleased to announce that we are joining hands with our local Caldwell Heritage Museum in a joint effort to further enhance our history for Caldwell County. I'm proud to announce too that I'm now a board member, and it's great to be joining our museum.
Caldwell History Museum could not be more proud to have Mr. Bill Tate here on board. It's fantastic to enjoy the presence of another man who's just as passionate about Caldwell County, if not more so, and its history, and such a wonderful history. And we are glad to have you, sir.
Thank you. And in addition to what we've said here, I'd like to say that Caldwell County Now and Then does not accept donations. And if you like the work we do, please donate to our museum. And what's that address, Colin? Do you remember?
Absolutely. 112 Baden Street, Lenore, North Carolina.